Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope that I will be able to guide you a little bit from one side of the road to the other. It is indeed an issue that I'd like to discuss briefly. But let me first express my sincere appreciation for the invitation to come to Lisbon. It's always a joy to be here. Thank you very much indeed. Heartfelt thanks, sinceros agradecimentos ao professor Luís Moraes e sua equipe, especialmente Natália e Maria José, para a organização desta conferência de verão altamente valorizada. For the remainder, I'll speak in English. My talk is indeed about EMU law developments, and it is a little bit abstract and perhaps remote from the conference themes. Yet I think that the context of EMU is important for the study of financial regulation supervision. I will discuss banking union elements, apart from other elements of EMU, but I must already disappoint you from the beginning for those who think that I will say more about the proceedings of the Administrative Board of Review, as they are confidential, and follow-up proceedings at the Court of Justice are not always labeled as such. So it's not always clear if you look at the court proceedings whether they are able follow-up matters. Which brings me to a disclaimer. This is what I do in practical life for engagements. I speak here as a professor, as an academic, part-time professor of law in Amsterdam, not yet axed by budget cuts in Amsterdam, and a visiting professorial fellow at Queen Mary in London. Nothing that I say can be attributed to the ECB, to ABOR, or to the SSM. Today is a special day for Europe. Others have said so before. The United Kingdom, as we all know, is voting whether, and I'm now quoting Wolfgang Münchau in the Financial Times earlier this week, to remain on the outer sphere of the inner circle or to join the inner sphere of the outer circle of our union. There's much to be said and deplored, as far as I'm concerned, about what I would call a silly exercise in direct democracy on an issue which has been hijacked by the media and politicians who for many years have been misreporting and misrepresenting the EU layer of governance in what I would call our multi-layer system of governance in Europe. It is not as bad as the Dutch referendum, the consultative referendum that we had earlier this year, which was won by Europhobes, I must confess, where the Ukraine Association Agreement, partially an EU affair, partially a member state affair, was threatened by the votes of less than two-thirds of 32% of the voters turning out in this consultative referendum in my home state, which represents the very 3.5% of the population of the Union. And yet the UK referendum, I dare to say, is a bad example of blackmail at the EU level. And with the EBA located in London and its chair earlier this week already saying that they have to leave London, the financial centre, if there is a Brexit, I think it's all very much of relevance also for the issue of this conference. But we have to wait the results. Talking about the various spheres, let me just quote David Cameron, who yesterday acknowledged we in Britain have the best of both worlds. We are almost outside, but yet he wants them to remain in. And the legal issue is that it's very much not understood, I think, perhaps not in Britain, but also not in other member states, how this system of multi-layer governance works, this middle-of-the-road system that we have. The Financial Times this morning said the UK is a sovereign state, that's why we have this memorandum. And I had a very interesting exchange of emails with Philip Stevens, the political correspondent of the Financial Times, who, I tweeted about that earlier in the winter, who said, you don't understand anything about our parliamentary system, when I wrote him in comments of what he wrote in the Financial Times. And I replied, you don't understand anything of the European system with its supremacy. Back to the euro area. Again, from the Financial Times this weekend. An interesting qualification of what the euro area is. It worries Adar Turner, who is quoted here, because it is a society of large and imperfectly integrated ethnic, religious, and cultural minorities, large and to a degree uncontrolled immigration flows, still too high unemployment, and huge internal balances. When I read that, I thought he was referring to the European Union at large, which can be similarly characterized. Turner exposes, I have to admit, the traditional view of Europe and of the euro area, with a focus on nation states and their imbalances, instead of what I would think we should do more, apart from focusing on the nation states, focusing on the entire euro area, taking a holistic view. An area, the euro area, but also Europe at large, faced with indeed unprecedented migration from abroad and from neighboring countries, which, whatever their level of welcoming and care, which sometimes has much to be deplored about, but they accommodate far larger number of refugees than we in Europe. And I'm talking, of course, of Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon. Behind the curtain of all these populist inclinations, further work is ongoing on the construction of Europe and in the euro area, even though you wouldn't think of it. In a recent article that is going to appear as an editorial in the law journal of the faculty where I teach, I summed up some of the elements of progress, whether you agree with the substantive norms that have been adopted or not, progress that has been made at the federal level recently. Proposals on the digital single market. Capital Markets Union, I don't have to go into that, we've just had an excellent expose on that. Personal data protection, 3 legal acts adopted recently on that, also having to do with passenger information exchange with the United States. Again, if you agree with the substance, that's not the issue. The issue is that there is some kind of progress that doesn't even meet the eye when you read the media. Enforcement of competition law vis-a-vis technological giants in the US, and of course the discussions on deposit insurance. My call would be for all of us, practitioners that you rightly called me, academics and us as citizens, to take a broader perspective, going beyond the confines of history or the prism of what is known. I think that only by being imaginative, by using our faculties to shape our own reality, we can count on progressing from the current malaise. First, looking externally. In the past couple of weeks, several events have taken place in the area of EMU law, amongst which 2 concern the relationship with the IMF. Now, I know I'm talking in Portugal, mentioning the IMF may not be very popular, but I do so anyway. First of all, interesting to see that the IMF's Article 4 review, the recurrent review that they do on jurisdictions, this time of the Eurozone, was discussed in the Eurogroup on the 16th of June. And the IMF calls for centralized fiscal support. I'm quoting them. Even mentioning a euro area treasury. So that's a reply to those who question whether that is still an issue to be discussed in its concluding statement, which is public. And of course, it also calls for structural reforms and budgetary constraint, stronger enforcement of the rules. I myself consider it remarkable that this authority, worldwide authority for monetary and financial stability, makes these kind of calls. On the very same day of that Eurogroup discussion, the official journal of the European Union published an opinion by the European Central Bank on a Commission proposal for unified representation of the euro area. And that is a proposal of October 2015, which replaces an earlier one of 17 years ago, 1998, which was duly withdrawn. It took that long to even discuss an issue of unified representation. The ECB emphasizes in its opinion that gradual unification, which is what the Commission proposes, of the representation of the euro area in the IMF needs to respect its independence, the ECB's independence, and the internal allocation of responsibilities within the Union. The ECB very legally says that when it comes to monetary policy, that concept in the relevant treaty article about external representation is far more than just monetary policy. It's all the powers related to the euro laid down in Articles 127, 133 TFEU. It also refers to the euro system's often forgotten duty to support the economic policies in the Union and to its role in banking union, to to ensure what it calls safety and soundness of credit institutions, plural. All of this leads the ECB to critically welcome the proposal, whilst noting that it is still based on a country-based organization of the IMF, with countries having their own representation or being in groups in the IMF. Under traditional thinking, such an approach to the IMF Articles of Agreement denies membership to a supranational organization, a middle-of-the-road organization like the EU or the euro area, which has assumed both monetary policy and exchange rate policy powers of its constituent states. Not to mention, by the way, the powers in the area of payments and capital, often forgotten, especially since we have now capital controls, which are actually payments restrictions in Cyprus and certainly in Greece, which are IMF-related competencies and which reinforce the argument for EU membership of the fund. Two brief things still on this ECB opinion. The ECB says we have this injunction in the Treaty of sincere cooperation among member states with the Union and the Union with the member states. And I think they do that because they want to insist on their independence. They want to have their own voice heard at the IMF. They also, interestingly, make a reference to Article 138, which has a distinction between, in the first paragraph, the international, the common positions, which the Council is under an obligation to adopt, and in the second, the unified representation, which the Council may adopt. And what they fear, of course, is when you start on the second paragraph of unified representation, then you get also into the area of common positions, which the ECB is no longer independent to have. As I said before in my thesis in a conference in Rome earlier this year on the democratic principle and EMU, they are compatible, apparently, at least according to the organizers of the conference. The European Union should accede to the IMF, which should respect the independence while respecting the independence of the ECB. I also think, and I'm not in agreement with the proposal made, that the Commission, rather than the President of the Eurogroup, should represent the EU in Washington. Other events in the area of EMU and financial regulation that are on the agenda of at least the European Parliament these weeks. First of all, Daniel Nouy was at the European Parliament for the regular hearing on banking union, one element of an extensive set of accountability measures that have been adopted, laid down in Articles 20 and 21 of the SSM regulation, and in the MOU with the Council and the interinstitutional agreement with the European Parliament on accountability. But also on the agenda of the European Parliament are retail financial services for a market that hardly exists, deposit insurance, of course, and economic governance. I'd like to say a little bit about that. Our current economic governance model is state-focused and adversarial in nature. Economic developments are assessed at a nationwide level, thus overlooking regional differences or convergence. Even in middle-sized states, economic circumstances may differ and vary among regions, let alone in bigger member states, where the economic activity level may be more aligned between northern Italy and Bavaria in Germany than between either region and the Mezzogiorno or Saxe-Anhalt, or between Lisbon and Helsinki than between these cities and Madeira or Lapland. This state focus, understandable and correct as it to a certain extent is, strengthens national disparities at the expense of regional needs. It reinforces national reflexes, as for instance the whole system of the ESM reinforces national reflexes. Lorenzo Binismaghi has once said, the way we organized the European Stability Mechanism makes for parliaments being set against one another. The German parliament has to agree with something, and the Greek parliament, it's national parliaments against each other. So my question would be, can we perhaps envisage more emphasis on regional economic developments and guidance on these? I would argue for a return to the idea of l'Europe des régions that the European federalists have pleaded in favor of. As I said, another feature is the adversarial nature of the whole system. It puts the center against the nation state. National governments are subject to rules imposed by the Brussels bureaucrats, the political body entrusted with executive action and guardian functions under the treaty, but which is misrepresented by media and politicians alike. When budgetary rules are not followed, and I refer here to the Minister of Finance of my home state, chairman of the Eurogroup, he starts to lambaste the Commission for doing that. Calls are then invariably made for the imposition of pecuniary sanctions, which has never taken place except in one instance, the instance of Spain, where a region, the region of Valencia, was responsible for severely misreporting budgetary data, which led to the imposition of a fine on Spain by the European Commission in 2015, last year. It's all very confrontational and, to my mind, not very effective. It's time to reflect whether we can do better, avoiding the current continuous conflicted relationship between European and state capitals. Which brings me to a third point on economic governance. It's rules-based. Rules that are then applied with the discretion that the political bodies necessarily have. But euro area discretionary measures, decisions on expansionary or contracting budgetary policies for society as a whole, are not on the menu, even though I know we have the Juncker Fund and regional policies. When promoting deeper EMU, the Five Presidents report, under the lines of the Five Presidents report, I think we should explore the option of euro area policy stances. And also, again, the functions of an a euro area, treasury, alongside what I think we need to have, automatic stabilizers, an euro area unemployment benefit scheme. You see, I'm being very imaginative here. And yet. Finally, on economic governance, the rules should be more transparent. There is a current hodgepodge of legal acts that is unintelligible for the uninitiated. And even I, as a supposed EMU law expert, get lost at times. We have at least 12 different legal acts that sum up all the rules for economic governance. We have the treaty, we have, not going to sum them up, a resolution of the European Council, we have all kinds of secondary legislation that a student or an interested citizen to research has to go back and forth to, flipping from one legal act to the other to finally see what applies in a situation. When the Fiscal Compact Treaty and the Treaty on the Single Resolution Fund are to be integrated in the TFEU, as they say they are to be within a couple of years, and I would also advocate integrating the ESM Treaty, I think an overhaul of the economic governance rules should also be considered to reflect this preference for clarity and transparency that I profess. Which brings me back to transparency in banking union. There is a lot already, but more can be done. In their recent study for Bruegel, European banking supervision the first 18 months, Nicolas Véron and Dirk Schoenmaker plead for more transparency, especially on banks' figures. They say there's a lot that has been done, but I quote them, where European banking supervision falls short, however, is on transparency on the banks themselves. Now, I understand I have no support from at least one of the previous speakers who said that the Pillar 2 disclosure under SREPS is already going to 4, but this is, I think, an area where we could also emulate the other side of the ocean. Let me remind, necessary, but let me do so anyway, that major strides have already been made in the ECB's main area of responsibility, monetary policy. Effective, transparent explanations on what the ECB undertakes and an open dialogue with parliaments at EU and national level have been initiated by its president, by Mario Draghi. He steered the ECB towards regular accounts of the Governing Council's monetary policy meetings, in spite of the treaty injunction that the proceedings are to be confidential and only the outcome of the deliberations may be made public. Draghi has appeared before the national parliaments of course, Germany, Italy and Finland as well, as before the European Parliament, and he, it's not on a slide, rightly emphasized that that is to be the focus of the ECB's accountability in a Q&A a couple of months ago. Transparency in banking union also requires, I'll come back to that in a sec, the singleness of the European single rulebook, which is not single enough. Transparency, I consider that one of the aspects of democratic legitimacy, and another one is accountability before the courts, of course. Apart from review cases that we have had at ABOR, there are judicial challenges before the European Court, and I have listed them here. They are publicly sourced. You'll see at least one from Portugal. You'll see several from France. So this is what is at this moment before the court, not yet a specialized chamber of the court in the area of challenging prudential supervision of the ECB. Final word on banking union, which is a substantive point. The SSM regulation makes it crystal clear that the ECB is overseeing holding companies over banking groups, which in EU parlance is mixed financial holding companies or financial holding companies. The precise extent of that competence is somewhat unclear due to different home bias of the national supervisors in the SSM. In order to make it unequivocally clear that these entities that effectively had effectively had banking groups, I would plead for European bank holding regulation, at least for the euro area. Europe is behind Africa. We have to look south for this, where several jurisdictions have clear legislation subjecting bank holding companies to incisive supervision. Okay, let me end this sometimes rather technical debate with a few provocative statements. We need a German voice in the debate about Europe. German? You don't dare to ask, but you think all. We've seen sufficient hegemony of the EU's largest state. Whether for good, in my opinion, Angela Merkel's Wir schaffen das, we can do it with the refugees, or for bad, Wolfgang Schäuble's insistence on balanced budgets and German taxpayers' interests. The northern states of Finland, Germany, and the Netherlands have had a preponderant say in Europe's affairs as reticent creditor states. And this very week also, on EMU, the German Constitutional Court accepted the validity of the OMT program of the ECB, but by insisting on such program or any other measures from the European Union to not impinge upon the constitutional identity of the people. Constitutional identity of the people, reflect on that. Which of course means the German people, not the European people. Very briefly, extending on this, they rightly, I think, say that democratic legitimacy is an issue that courts should be involved with when it comes to such an independent entity as the ECB. But they then start to criticize the judicial review undertaken by the court in the OMT case before. And they say that the European Union, and they're right there, that is in the treaty, need to respect the constitutional identity of individual member states. And then they end, the Karlsruhe judges, by enumerating several elements of the OMT program that the Bundesbank, as a German entity, needs to comply with in order to be exercising its valid competencies under German law. Otherwise, they're acting ultra vires. Now, these conditions that the German Constitutional Court sets, admittedly, have been taken over from the judgment of the European Court, so it's not really a contradiction, but nevertheless, it's strange to see the highest constitutional court of a member state, even a larger one, or the largest, to say that its own legal entities, government entities, cannot do something without complying with its injunctions. So, sufficiently heard the German voice, you would say. And yet, interesting suggestions have been made in 2013 by the Glinec group. They said we need some sort of euro area co-financing of unemployment benefits. I already said so just before, to smooth the functioning of the labor market and to have automatic stabilizers in the union. And if legal voices are to be heard, I would urge you not only to go to Karlsruhe, but also to hear, for instance, Professor Meyer from Bielefeld, who is not pounding on the recurrent themes of sovereignty of the people. There is another German voice that I'd like to be heard. Ulrike Gero, doesn't sound very German, very French rather, who is from the European Democracy Lab and the European School of Governance in Berlin. And she wrote a book which is only out in German and which I haven't read fully yet, so I must confess that I don't know whether I agree with all what she says, but I agree with the core statement. Warum Europa eine Republik werden muss, why Europe should become a republic. She says we need in Europe a republican form of government which duly acknowledges all its citizens in the areas of taxation, law, and voting rights, where we don't have equality now and we should have in the future. I think that it is such kind of imaginative thinking that we need to quaff our thirst for a relinking of Europe with its citizens with. Second, as I said before, we need more transparency in the operations of the Union. Also in the area of EMU and banking union, banks data, singleness of the rule book, which, by the way, also helps the operators to know which are the exact rules they have to abide by. Economic governance, two areas. One, the overhaul of all the various legal acts. Second, a very technical one, which I'd like to draw your attention to. What we've seen in the past is all kinds of legal documents combining the conditionality for financial support for governments. MOUs, legal acts adopted under the TFEU, but they don't always are completely the same. They're different. They are different in contents. The legal acts adopted under the TFEU do not fully overlap with what is in the MOUs. Now, they are available, the MOUs, on websites of the IMF and the ESM, but they still lead citizens and companies not to have a complete and immediate access to the many obligations that there are. So I would plead for, from a legal perspective, having all these conditionality in EU legal acts, which also helps enforcement because of the supremacy. This should not be taken at all as endorsement of the contents of those measures. Far from it. Two last elements. First, the cultural aspect. I've said so before here in Lisbon. We shouldn't underestimate that element of the EU project. Acculturation among the supervisory regimes is taking place now in the joint supervisory teams, very much so. But what we, I think, still need is a growing awareness of the different languages we speak. We all know we speak different languages, but sometimes we don't know what a word or a term actually means in a different language. And enabling our younger citizens to speak and to conduct conversations in a second language is an education investment I think we should make. Talking about culture, I could also speak, but I won't, about banking culture, which is a separate aspect of what the cultural aspect of the SSM is. Fourth, last point, I think what we need in times of crisis is a combination of disciplinary approaches to our problems and a continuous testing whether such policies are humane. I'd like to end by quoting a Portuguese who lives and works in Liverpool, which is a combination of what I do today, being in Portugal, thinking of Britain. In the introduction that he wrote to a forthcoming book, The Human Face of the European Union, Are EU Law and Policy Humane Enough? Nuno Ferreira of the Liverpool Law School calls for a human-centered analysis in which humaneness is central. Humane in the sense of humain, menschlich. He defines it as follows. Humaneness is the corrective of humanity when it is not at its best. And it is with this call for humaneness in our development of policies and of the law, both in the area of EMU and beyond, that I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much for your attention.